Hello there, it's me Josh. Welcome to Story Time. I'm super excited as always for stories. Are you? Yes? Oh, that's what I like to hear. Little Miss Tiny, we're going to be reading today by Roger Hargreaves. Now it's from the Little Miss Library. For all you little misses and Mr. Men out there, get comfortable, get ready, because we're about to delve into story time. That's right. It's like a little dance move. I love dancing. Dancing's fun. Little Miss Tiny by Roger Hargreaves. Let's find out what's going to happen in this story. What messages and things we can learn from this. All right. Little Miss Tiny was extremely small. Not very tall at all. She was so very tiny she didn't live in a house. Do you know where she lived? In a mouse hole. In the dining room of Home Farm. You can see little Miss Tiny there. Hanging out in the mouse hole because she's very small. She'd made that mouse hole quite comfortable, really. And luckily there weren't any mice because the farm cat had chased them all away. That's lucky. The trouble was, because she was so tiny, nobody knew she lived there. Nobody had noticed her. Not even the farmer and his wife. So there she lived all alone with nobody to talk to. She was very lonely and sad. Oh dear. Got a little tear streaming down her face. One day, she was feeling so lonely she decided to be very brave and go for a walk. Out of her mouse hole she came. She crept across the dining room and went through the crack in the door and into the hall. Off on an adventure. Let's see what little Miss Tiny can discover. To little Miss Tiny, the hall looked as big as a field. She scuttled across it to the back door of the farm. Luckily for her, the letterbox was at the bottom of the door, and she squeezed herself through it and onto the doorstep. It was all very exciting. Got a nice little smile there. There before her was the farmyard. She went exploring. She came to a door with a gap at the bottom and ducked in underneath. Can you see little Miss Tiny there behind the leaves? Good. There inside was a pig, a large pig. And if you're as small as little Miss Tiny, a large pig looks very large indeed. Miss Tiny looked at the pig. The pig looked at Miss Tiny. Boink, he grunted, and moved closer to inspect this little person who had entered his sty. It's a little standoff. Little Miss Tiny and the pig, working out who's who, what's what. Oh my goodness me, squeaked little Miss Tiny in alarm and shot out of the pigsty as fast as ever. As fast as ever her little legs would carry her, which wasn't very fast because her legs were so very little. She ran right round to the back of the pigsty before she stopped. She leaned against the wall, put her hands over her eyes and tried to get her breath back. Look at little Miss Tiny go there. It's like zoom. Suddenly she heard a noise, a very close noise, a sort of breathing noise, very close indeed. Oh, she hardly dared to take her hands away from her eyes, but when she did, she wished she hadn't. What do you think it was there, right in front of her, looking at her with green eyes? She's like, oh, I don't want to see. Ginger, the farm cat. Poor little Miss Tiny. Ginger grinned, showing his teeth. Help! Shrieked little Miss Tiny at the top of her voice. Oh, somebody please help! The trouble was, the top of little Miss Tiny's voice was not a very loud place. Ginger grinned another grin. Uh-oh. Maybe Ginger might want to play with little Miss Tiny, or hopefully not eat little Miss Tiny. Every day Mr. Strong went to Home Farm to buy some eggs. He liked eggs. If any of you have read Mr. Strong, we've read that one before. Just feel free to look it up or subscribe and go and find it within the channel. He loves eggs. Loves eggs. Eats lots and lots and lots and lots of eggs. So hopefully Mr. Strong can help little Miss Tiny out when he's getting these eggs. That day he was walking home across the farmyard when he heard a very tiny squeak. He stopped. There it was again, round the corner. He looked around the corner and saw Ginger and the poor, trapped little Miss Tiny. There's Mr. Strong, carrying a little basket of eggs. "Shoo," said Mr. Strong to Ginger, and picked up little Miss Tiny very gently. "Hello," he said. "Who are you?" I'm Miss Tiny." "You are, aren't you?" smiled Mr. Strong. "Well, if I was as tiny as you, I wouldn't go wandering around large farmyards." "But," said Miss Tiny, and told Mr. Strong about how she was so lonely and she had to come out to find somebody to talk to. "Oh dear," said Mr. Strong. "Well now, let's see if we can't find you some friends to talk to." That's nice of Mr. Strong. And now every week, Mr. Strong collects little Miss Tiny and takes her off to see her friends. 3 weeks ago, he took her to see Mr. Funny, who told her so many jokes she just couldn't stop laughing all day. We've also read Mr. Funny. That's a funny story, so to speak. If you want to delve back and read that one from the Mr. Men library, go for it. 2 weeks ago, he took her to see Mr. Greedy. He told her his recipe for his favourite meal. "But that's much, much too much for tiny little me," she laughed. Mr. Greedy grinned. "For you," he said, "divide by 100. Mr. Greedy's also another great story. Good messages and things to be learned. Last week, Mr. Strong took her to see Mr. Silly, and Mr. Silly showed her how to stand on your head. "That's very silly," giggled little Miss Tiny. "Thank you," replied Mr. Silly modestly. Mr. Silly. All great characters from great stories and great books. And guess who she met this week? Somebody who's become a special little friend. "I never thought I'd ever meet anybody smaller than myself," laughed Mr. Small. Little Miss Tiny looked up at him and smiled. Isn't that a good little combination? Mr. Small and Mr. Tiny. No, sorry, little Miss Tiny. That's great. "You wait till I grow up," she said. Maybe little Miss Tiny might be taller than Mr. Small. Wouldn't that be funny? Alright. Thanks so much for reading the story with me today. I hope you liked it. I'll be back again with another story really soon. We're going to get further and further and deeper down the Little Miss library. Lots and lots of fun stories and things to be told from there. Alright. If you like these stories, please click the bell below and subscribe. Bye for now, but not forever. I'm Josh and this is Storytime. Thanks.